The story of the Manson family has been told countless times, often focusing on its most notorious figures, those who spoke the loudest, acted the boldest, or committed the most shocking crimes. But in the shadows of this dark chapter in history are also the quiet ones, individuals whose silence has left questions unanswered and narratives incomplete. This video tells the stories of two such women, Ella Jo Bailey and the first member of the family, Mary Brunner. Mary was a bright, college-educated assistant librarian from Wisconsin who abandoned her stable life for what she believed was a journey toward love, freedom, and spiritual awakening. She gave birth to Manson's son and helped lay the foundation of what became the family. Yet her journey was marked by heartbreak, violence, and betrayal. Ella Jo Bailey, another early member, was a college student from Michigan who joined the family months after Mary. Unlike the others, she lived with a quiet but growing discontent, ultimately walking away before the family's most infamous crimes. Despite their intelligence and the nurturing qualities that drew others into Manson's orbit, the quietness of both Mary and Ella leaves critical pieces of history unspoken. Today, Mary Brunner is still alive, but she remains silent. Ella Jo Bailey passed away without ever telling her story. This silence does more than protect them. It shields the truth and perpetuates the mysteries surrounding the family. As we delve into their lives, we're left wondering, what could we learn if those who lived these moments felt safe enough to share their truths? Ella Jo Bailey was born in Omaha, Nebraska on January 15, 1947. Very little has been documented about her childhood, upbringing, or parents, though photographs place her in a Holland, Michigan high school yearbook in 1965. She later attended Western Michigan University in Kalamazoo. During the summer after her sophomore year, Ella Jo and two friends borrowed her grandfather's car for a vacation in California. According to her grandfather, the other two young women returned home, but Ella did not. By the fall of 1967, Ella Jo was living in San Francisco, sharing an apartment near the intersection of Oak and Leon Streets with her boyfriend and two other couples. Janis Joplin lived just a few doors away, and they could sometimes hear her singing from their kitchen window. San Francisco at the time was a magnet for young people searching for freedom, community, and meaning, and Ella Jo, quiet, observant, and curious, was swept into its energy. On the morning of November 10, 1967, just after meeting Charles Manson, Susan Atkins, one of Ella Jo's roommates, visited her parole officer and asked for permission to travel with friends. He told her he would consider it. Before he had decided, ultimately denying the request, Susan had already left town with Charles Manson, Mary Brunner, Lynette Frome, Patricia Krenwinkel, and she brought Ella Jo and another woman, Barbara, along with them on their travels. Ella Jo and Barbara spent several weeks with the group before returning to San Francisco. At times, Ella Jo's boyfriend accompanied them. But after a short period, Ella and Barbara returned home. Weeks later, Susan called Ella Jo and urged her to rejoin the group, now in the Los Angeles area. Ella Jo hitchhiked down. Diane Lake later recalled enjoying Ella Jo's presence perhaps the most during that season, describing her as shy but thoughtful, with a love of nature and quiet walks. Though often overshadowed by Susan's larger personality, Ella Jo had a gentle humor and a perceptive eye, observing more than she spoke. One spring afternoon, after a morning at the beach, Ella Jo and Patricia Krenwinkel were hitchhiking on the Sunset Strip when a rugged, good-looking man pulled over and offered them a ride. Instead of dropping them off where they were staying in Topanga Canyon, he invited them to his home in the Pacific Palisades. The three sat in the kitchen together, drinking milk and eating cookies, and then they went into the bedroom and had sex. Only afterward did he introduce himself. Dennis Wilson, drummer for the Beach Boys. Later that night, Dennis returned home around 3 a.m. after a studio session to find a black school bus parked in his driveway and lights in the house on inside. When he cautiously opened the door, he was greeted by Charles Manson, grinning. Dennis asked if the man intended to hurt him. Charlie assured him he meant no harm, then knelt and kissed his feet. Inside, Dennis found a dozen people partying, mostly young women. Pat and Ella hurried over to introduce him to Charlie, though Manson clearly already knew who he was. Charlie then encouraged several women to take their host to bed. Charlie and several others stayed at Wilson's home for several weeks, but before long, Manson realized that keeping the entire group at Wilson's place would strain his relationship with the musician, especially with a crying baby present. He sent Mary Brunner, their son Valentine Michael, and several women, including Ella Jo, north to Mendocino County and told them to recruit young men. They traveled north in the old black school bus and rented a house in the small town of Philo. On June 22nd, the women in Mendocino were arrested after befriending 3 teenage boys in the neighborhood. The women shared drugs and sex with the teens, but when one boy had a bad trip and panicked, his mother called the police. Officers found marijuana and LSD at the house. Mary was arrested for narcotics possession. Patricia Krenwinkel, Susan Atkins, Stephanie Rowe, and Ella Jo were arrested for prostitution. The women were held in jail, and Mary's infant son was temporarily placed in foster care. The women, dubbed the Mendocino Witches by police, were released on August 16th after 55 days in jail. When their bus broke down on the return trip south, family member Bobby Beausoleil offered to retrieve them. The following month, the women went to trial. Mary received a 60-day sentence and served 4 weeks. The others, including Ella, were acquitted. Sandra Good later described Ella Jo as looking like out of a 1930s Broadway musical, with large blue eyes, wavy blonde hair, and an old top hat. Others said that she looked like Greta Garbo. In early 1969, the family was staying at a rented house in Canoga Park, rented through Bill Van Sickle, an ex-con and former associate of Manson's. Bill quickly took an interest in Ella Jo, and Manson exploited that liaison. Within a week, Ella Jo, Susan Atkins, Mary Brunner, and others were working as topless dancers in the valley to bring in money. The stripping gig did not last long for the women, and slowly, over the next few months, the situation with the family became more and more desperate. That summer, when Charlie began pressing members to identify anyone who might have money, Ella Jo mentioned that she had heard that family friend and musician Gary Hinman may have recently come into an inheritance. It was not true, however, but Charlie asked Ella to go to Gary's house and request the money. Ella Jo declined, not because she suspected violence, but because she simply didn't want to go. Instead, a sequence of events occurred over the next 2 weeks that ultimately led to the first murder by the Manson family. In late July, as Ella Jo later testified, she heard Charlie tell Bobby Beausoleil and Bruce Davis to go to Hinman's to get money. She saw Bobby leave with a knife and Bruce with a gun. She watched Mary and Susan leave the ranch with them. When Bobby, Mary, and Susan returned a couple days later, Ella saw Gary's VW, hot-wired, and later his red Fiat at the ranch. Mary asked Ella to help her wipe down the car for fingerprints. Ella later testified that Charlie told her about a violent confrontation that occurred at Gary's home, including cutting Gary with a sword, and that Bobby Beausoleil had stabbed Hinman to death. Within 24 hours of learning this, Ella Jo and Bill Van Sickle fled. She was later arrested in Ohio on forged check charges and abandoned by Bill. In May 1970, during the pre-trial phase, Ella Jo was questioned by the Los Angeles Sheriff's Office. She admitted mentioning Gary's alleged inheritance and repeated statements she heard after the killing. She agreed to testify. Her mother relocated from Michigan to California during the trials to be with her daughter and support her. Ella Jo eventually married, had 3 children, divorced, and built a quiet professional life as a technical librarian for the Yucca Mountain Research Project near Las Vegas. The project was a long-running U.S. Department of Energy effort to study and document a proposed deep geologic repository in Nevada for the storage of spent nuclear fuel and high-level radioactive waste, involving decades of scientific, engineering, and regulatory research. Ella later retired to Florida. She died in 2015 of emphysema and is remembered fondly by her children and grandchildren. Mary Teresa Brunner was the first person to offer Charles Manson something he had never truly had before: a stable home, intellectual companionship, and unconditional acceptance. Born in 1943 and raised in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, Mary was the eldest of 4 children in a conservative Lutheran family. Quiet, intelligent, and introspective, she moved to California in the mid-1960s, leaving behind a fiancé and a predictable future in favor of something less defined. By 1967, she was working as an assistant librarian in Berkeley and living alone with her poodle, Muffet. Independent, but deeply lonely. Mary met Manson shortly after his release from prison. Their connection began cautiously. She offered him her couch for the night and companionship, but not sex. What followed was a gradual emotional entanglement in which Mary became both confidant and caretaker. She listened to Manson's jailhouse stories without judgment, shared her own beliefs about environmental stewardship and community, and provided him with material stability. These early conversations shaped much of Manson's later rhetoric, particularly his views on nature, society, and conditioning. Mary's importance to the emerging group cannot be overstated. When Manson brought other young women into her apartment, runaways, seekers, and drifters, Mary did not resist. Instead, she welcomed them. She modeled openness, generosity, and emotional availability, setting the tone for how women were expected to receive one another. Her home became the family's first gathering place, and Mary its quiet center of gravity. As Lynette Frome joined, then Patricia Krenwinkel, Susan Atkins, Ella Jo Bailey, and others, Mary functioned as a stabilizer and bridge. The younger women often bonded with her as much as with Manson himself. She offered reassurance, mediated tensions, and helped normalize the increasingly unconventional dynamics of shared partners, shared space, and shared identity. Several women later acknowledged that their attachment to Mary and the other women was as powerful as their attachment to Charlie. Mary's role evolved further when she became pregnant. The birth of her son, Valentine Michael, in April 1968, symbolically transformed the group into what resembled a family unit, with Mary cast, by both circumstance and Manson's design, as the maternal figure. She helped organize daily life, meals, travel, and childcare, even as Manson tightened his control and the group became more transient. Yet Mary also absorbed the brunt of Charlie's volatility. As pressures mounted, arrests, poverty, jealousy, and his fear of abandonment, she became one of his primary emotional and physical targets. Despite this, she remained loyal far longer than most. Her continued presence lent legitimacy and continuity to the group, especially for newcomers who saw in Mary, Mother Mary as she was often called, a thoughtful, educated woman who seemed to have chosen this life willingly. Mary Brunner never spoke publicly about these years, leaving much of her inner life opaque. What is clear, however, is that without her early acceptance, her home, and her willingness to welcome others into the fold, the Manson family would not have formed as it did. Mary was not simply the first follower, she was the emotional doorway through which nearly everyone else entered. By the spring of 1969, the Manson family's financial situation had become desperate. Mary scavenged where she could, befriending a manager at Van de Kamp's bakery on South Figueroa, who allowed her to take day-old goods. But charity was not enough. The group had burned through personal connections, worn out sympathizers, and increasingly relied on theft. Manson instructed everyone to steal for survival. In July 1969, Mary herself stole a new Volkswagen directly from a dealership, drove it to Spahn Ranch, and helped strip it for parts before abandoning the show. Gary Hinman had been one of the family's most consistent benefactors and a good friend to Mary. A gentle, generous musician, he provided food, clothing, shelter, and emotional support. He also allowed Mary to use his address for social services paperwork so she could retain custody of her son, and he opened his home to several family members. When money dried up, Hinman was increasingly viewed as a potential source of funds, based on rumors that he had received an inheritance. While we do not fully understand the circumstances by which Gary became a target, we do know from later testimony that Bobby Beausoleil told Mary he was going to Hinman's on July 26th to get money, despite her insistence that Gary wouldn't have any. That evening, both Mary and Susan Atkins left the ranch with Bobby Beausoleil, Bruce Davis, and Danny DiCarlo. Mary and Susan were used to gain entry, confirming Hinman was alone. Bobby then entered with a knife and a gun, and the other two drove away. What followed was a prolonged, escalating confrontation. After a struggle over the gun, Mary called Spahn Ranch for help. Charlie and Bruce Davis arrived shortly thereafter. In front of the others, Manson slashed Hinman's face with a sword, severely injuring him, and then had Mary tend to his own wounded hand. Charlie and Davis then left, knowing Hinman would likely go to the police if he were not stopped. A day and a half later, Bobby Beausoleil killed Gary Hinman, first stabbing him in the chest. As Hinman lingered, wounded and barely conscious, Mary and Susan cleaned the house and wiped down fingerprints. When he failed to die, Mary and Susan took turns holding a pillow over his face, helping him to suffocate. Still, Bobby wound up having to stab Gary once more before he died. Before leaving, Beausoleil staged the scene to suggest political violence. The three left in Hinman's car and returned to Spahn Ranch. 2 weeks later, on August 8th, Manson announced the onset of Helter Skelter, just days after Bobby was arrested on suspicion of Hinman's murder. That afternoon, that Friday, Mary and Sandra Good were sent to buy supplies using stolen credit cards. Their erratic behavior at the store led to a chase, a crash, and arrest. Mary was charged with burglary and forgery and transferred to Civil Brand Institute. Manson, despite having the means, allowed her to remain incarcerated for weeks, though Sandra was able to bail out. Mary was released in late September, while the family was in Death Valley after the Tate LaBianca and Shorty Shea murders. She fled to Wisconsin upon her release. In December 1969, she secured immunity in exchange for cooperation. In April 1970, she testified at Beausoleil's retrial, placing responsibility for Hinman's murder on Bobby while shielding Manson, an act that reflected her enduring loyalty even as the family collapsed around her. On April 21, 1970, Bobby Beausoleil was convicted of first-degree murder. Back in Wisconsin, Mary Brunner spiraled into depression, believing she had helped condemn someone she still saw as a brother. Sandra Good and Lynette Squeaky Frome traveled to her and urged her to take back what she'd said. Before sentencing, Beausoleil fired his lawyer, represented himself, and filed for a retrial. As part of that effort, he recalled Mary to court in California. Mary submitted an affidavit claiming her trial testimony had been false and given under pressure. Whiteley and Gunther of the Hinman investigation team, the two who had offered her immunity without realizing how deeply she was involved, hoped that she would unravel on the stand and incriminate herself. In court, Mary wavered. First, she insisted her earlier testimony wasn't true, implying investigators pushed her to accuse Bobby. Judge Keene pressed her for specifics, and Mary tried to invoke the Fifth Amendment, arguing she couldn't answer questions that might implicate her in the killing. The judge threatened contempt, while Beausoleil repeatedly objected that she had no attorney and was being coerced. After a court recess, Mary was appointed counsel and returned looking exhausted and shaken. The immunity terms were reaffirmed, and the judge emphasized that any testimony had to be voluntary. Mary then reversed herself again, explaining she had signed the false affidavit to try to spare Bobby the gas chamber. She testified that Manson cut Hinman with a sword, Beausoleil stabbed him, and she and Susan helped smother Hinman with a pillow as he lingered. Beausoleil's retrial motion was denied, and he was sentenced to death. At a later grand jury, Charles Manson, Susan Atkins, Bruce Davis, and Mary Brunner were indicted for the murder of Gary Hinman. For Whiteley and Gunther, Mary's admission that she had filed a false affidavit was not a moral reckoning but a legal opening. In their eyes, it meant her immunity agreement was no longer secure. Mary was rearrested that summer on the Hinman murder charge, briefly returned to custody, and then released on a writ of habeas corpus. Despite her proximity to the crime and her own admissions, she was never tried for her role in Hinman's death. After Bobby Beausoleil was sentenced, Mary did not step away from the family. She returned to it. Her allegiance at that point was no longer divided. Whatever fractures had formed during the trials closed again around Charles Manson. Mary left her son behind with her parents in Wisconsin, a choice that, viewed from the outside, looks incomprehensible, even unforgivable. But choices made inside coercive belief systems rarely resemble the clean moral calculations people expect of them. Mary's world had narrowed. The center of gravity had shifted. Loyalty had become identity. On August 21st, 1970, that loyalty took a new and violent form. Kenneth Como and Dennis Rice led Catherine Gypsy Scher, Mary Brunner, little Larry Giddings, and Chuck Lovett into the Western Surplus Store in Hawthorne, California. It was an Army-Navy supply shop, stocked wall-to-wall with firearms. The group entered armed, held staff and customers at gunpoint, and began loading more than 140 rifles, ostensibly to use in an effort to break Manson out of prison. But someone tripped a silent alarm. Police arrived quickly. A shootout followed. When it ended, both Mary and Gypsy were wounded. Everyone was arrested except Lovett, who managed to flee undetected for a couple days. The moment marked a decisive break, not just from the outside world, but from any remaining illusion that the family's actions were symbolic, spiritual, or misunderstood. This was no longer about belief. It was about force. In March 1973, Mary, who was wounded by gunfire during the shootout, was sentenced for her role in the Hawthorne event. She and Gypsy were sent to the California Institute for Women, housed in the same special unit alongside Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten. For a brief time, Susan, who had been ostracized by Pat and Leslie inside, believed she had found her family again. That illusion didn't last. She soon realized that Mary and Gypsy had shifted their loyalty once more, this time to Kenneth Como, and had not yet accepted a life outside crime or control. A year after their incarceration began, Mary and Gypsy were transferred to general population at Frontera. Mary Teresa Brunner had received a 20-year sentence for the Hawthorne shootout. Outside those prison walls, Mary's son Valentine Michael was growing up in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, raised by Mary's parents. For years, he believed his mother was his older sister. He did not know who his father was. That choice, shielding a child from a name that carried so much violence, may have been one of Mary's quiet acts of protection, even as her own life remained entangled with the consequences of the past. Mary was released in 1977 and returned to Wisconsin. Eventually, she regained custody of her son. In the 1980s, she moved to Forest Park, Illinois, where she worked in hospital administration, a life that bore little resemblance to the one the world remembers of the family. After her father's death in 2004 and her mother's in 2008, she returned again to Wisconsin. She remains active in her church, an environmentalist still, now also a grandmother. She has lived deliberately outside the public eye and has never granted interviews since the trials. Her son has spoken twice, once in the 1990s and again in 2019, tentatively, thoughtfully, trying to reconcile a legacy he never chose. Mary Brunner has carried more than 5 decades of silence. That silence is often interpreted as evasion or guilt. But silence can also be a form of endurance, a way to live forward without constantly reopening wounds that never properly healed. Yet history is not only built from verdicts and headlines, it is shaped by interior truths, by the moments before ideology hardened, before devotion curdled into violence. Mary was there at the beginning, when the family still felt like shelter, when acceptance felt like salvation. She understands something no one else fully can. Not just how the crimes happened, but why the belonging mattered so much that it eclipsed everything else. Time has changed what the world can hear. We now understand coercive control, trafficking, trauma bonding, and the slow erosion of self inside closed systems. We understand that people can be both responsible and human, both culpable and shaped by forces larger than they recognized at the time. If Mary were ever to speak, not in defense, not in absolution, but in truth, she would not be confessing to the past so much as illuminating it. Her voice would not excuse the harm. It would help us understand how ordinary needs for love, purpose, and family can be turned, step by step, into something destructive. And understanding, when it comes gently and honestly, does not threaten justice. It deepens it. The stories of Mary Brunner and Ella Jo Bailey, Mother Mary and Yeller as they were known, remind us of the complexity of the human experience. They were intelligent, compassionate, and deeply flawed individuals who became entangled in a web of manipulation, fear, and coercion. While they didn't seek the spotlight, their decisions, both spoken and unspoken, helped shape the course of history. As we reflect on their lives, we must ask ourselves, how many more truths remain locked away in silence with this story? For those who survived the Manson family, the weight of their stories is immense, but the need for their voices is even greater. Understanding the family's full narrative is not about condemnation. It's about truth, healing, and learning. To all former members of the family who remain silent, this is a reminder that your stories are vital. The world is ready to listen with compassion and understanding. By sharing your truth, you have the power to illuminate the past and free yourself from the shadows of history. It is safe to speak now. It is honorable. And maybe it is necessary. Let us hope that those who know the untold chapters of this saga find the courage to come forward before it is too late. History deserves their voices, and so do we. Of all the Manson family members, Susan Sadie Atkins is perhaps the most infamous. Her name is inexorably linked to the brutal crimes of 1969, her chilling courtroom confessions, and her transformation from lost teenager to convicted murderer to self-proclaimed penitent. Yet beneath the headlines and public outrage lies a deeply complex individual, a woman shaped by a childhood of neglect and chaos, whose search for love, stability, and belonging led her into the arms of Charles Manson and eventually into a life sentence for murder. But who was Susan Atkins really? A victim of circumstance? A manipulative performer? Or a soul caught between darkness and redemption, constantly reinventing herself in search of salvation?